In a small town where corruption thrived in the shadows, the Iron Fangs believed they were untouchable, their reign unchallenged. When Naomi Carter arrived, they saw just another outsider, alone, vulnerable, someone they could intimidate into silence. They had no idea the woman they cornered was a former Marine, that the dogs at her side were trained military canines, or that they had just declared war on someone who had spent years surviving battles far deadlier than anything they could imagine. What started as a simple act of harassment would spiral into something much bigger, an all-out fight for justice that would unravel the gang's entire operation. Before they realized their mistake, their power would be shattered, their secrets exposed, and the woman they underestimated would be the one standing over the ruins of everything they had built. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The late afternoon sun stretched long golden beams across the quiet suburban streets, painting the sidewalks with the warmth of a seemingly peaceful town. Naomi Carter walked at an even pace, her boots hitting the pavement in a steady rhythm. To any onlooker, she was just another resident, taking her dogs for an evening stroll. But there was something in her posture, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, that hinted at a deeper sense of awareness. This was a woman who knew how to command space, a woman who had been trained to move with purpose. At her sides, Max and Bolt trotted effortlessly, their lean, muscular forms alert but relaxed. The German Shepherd and Belgian Malinois had been with her through more battles than most men could stomach. They had saved her life more than once, and in return, she had given them something more than discipline. She had given them trust. No leash was needed. Her quiet commands were enough. They knew to stay close, to listen, to be ready. The quiet town she had moved to nearly 5 months ago had seemed, at first, like the perfect place to start over. A fresh beginning after years of deployments, of training soldiers, of watching lives slip through her fingers in the harshest corners of the world. She had chosen solitude, avoiding the entanglements of local gossip and neighborhood small talk. Most of the townspeople had ignored her presence entirely, while others gave her those looks, silent, measuring gazes that told her she would always be seen as an outsider. It didn't bother her. She wasn't here to make friends. But something about the past few weeks had set her instincts on edge. She had noticed an unusual presence in the areas surrounding her usual walking route. A parked truck that never seemed to move. A group of men lingering near the gas station just outside the residential block. Conversations that abruptly stopped when she passed by. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but her gut was telling her something was off. And Naomi Carter had long since learned that her gut was never wrong. Max's ears flicked forward suddenly, his body tensing for the briefest moment before resuming his pace. Naomi didn't react outwardly, but she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline sharpen her senses. She wasn't alone. She continued walking, slowing her pace slightly as she reached the secluded edge of town where the sidewalks gave way to a quiet stretch of road lined with dense trees. The tension in her chest coiled tighter, an unspoken warning from somewhere deep inside her bones. She wasn't sure what, but something was coming, and she would be ready. Naomi Carter didn't break her stride, but she had long since mastered the ability to scan her surroundings without making it obvious. The moment Max's posture shifted, even subtly, she knew something was about to change. Bolt, always the more intuitive of the two, had slowed his pace just slightly, his gaze flicking toward the tree line that bordered the cracked pavement. She inhaled deeply through her nose, keeping her movements measured. The streetlights hadn't yet flickered on, and the shadows were growing longer. The further she walked, the quieter it became, save for the occasional rustling of the trees swaying in the cool breeze. Then, almost too perfectly timed, she caught the sound of a vehicle approaching behind her. Not fast, not a typical pass-by, slow, deliberate. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled as she resisted the urge to turn her head. Instead, she listened. The engine was old, the low rumbling indicating a heavy-duty truck, probably American-made. It rolled to a near crawl, keeping pace with her for several long seconds before pulling up ahead, just past the narrow opening of a dirt path leading into the woods. It came to a stop. No one got out. Max and Bolt both turned their heads now, the shift in their breathing subtle but telling. They were waiting for her command. Naomi exhaled slowly, never losing her rhythm as she approached the vehicle. There were at least 4 figures inside, their silhouettes barely visible through the tinted windows. Her boots crunched against the gravel lining the shoulder of the road, her heartbeat steady, her body loose but ready. The driver's door opened, then the passenger side, and then, just as she had suspected, the back doors swung open, releasing the unmistakable stench of cigarette smoke, cheap beer, and something else she couldn't quite place. But whatever it was unpleasant. It hit her in a slow, creeping wave, the kind that lingered too long and clung to the back of her throat, the kind that told her she had stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time. 4 men stepped out, each moving with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. There was no hesitation, no scrambling or confusion. They weren't just spilling out into the night. They were spreading, positioning themselves with deliberate precision, not too obvious, not too rushed, just enough to make it clear that she was being boxed in. It wasn't overtly aggressive, not yet, but the intent was there. Simmering beneath the surface like embers waiting to catch fire, she kept walking. "Evenin', sweetheart," the stocky one called out, his voice coated in mockery, oozing a forced friendliness that was just a little too slick to be genuine. His stance was casual, his grin easy, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp, assessing, waiting to see how she reacted. The lanky one beside him let out a low chuckle, the sound almost lazy, almost amused, but not quite. "Bit late for a walk, ain't it?" His voice was lighter, but there was an edge to it, an unspoken weight beneath the words. Naomi didn't break her stride, but she felt their eyes on her, tracking her every movement, dissecting her body language, watching, measuring, deciding. The stocky one stepped into her path. She stopped. Not because she was intimidated, not because she was nervous, but because she had already calculated the scenario in her head, and it was better to let them speak first, to learn their angle before deciding her next move. The silence stretched between them, thick with expectation. "You're new around here," Stocky said, tilting his head slightly. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a statement of fact. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Just moved in," she said evenly, her voice giving away nothing. His grin widened, slow and knowing. "That right? See, the thing is, we've been having some issues lately." Naomi didn't respond, just waited. The lanky one took a step closer, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his oversized jacket. "You've been taking a lot of walks," he mused, his tone casual, conversational even, but there was something deliberate in the way he said it, the way he let the words settle. "Always out by the edge of town, near places you shouldn't be." That's when it clicked. She finally understood where this was going. They thought she was watching them. She exhaled slowly, keeping her breathing measured, steady. "I walk my dogs. That's all?" The third man, standing slightly behind the others, let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that carried just a little too much amusement, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny. "Yeah? See? That's a real funny coincidence." He glanced at the others before turning his gaze back to her. "'Cause a couple nights ago we had someone snooping around our property. Ain't from town, ain't supposed to be there." Stocky's grin sharpened. "And wouldn't you know it? Looked an awful lot like you." The accusation was clear now. They weren't just harassing her for fun. They were convinced she was a cop, or worse, someone working against them. Naomi didn't react. Her breathing remained steady, her posture neutral. "You sure got a real professional air about you," the lanky one continued, his smirk turning thoughtful. "Ain't like the folks around here. The way you carry yourself, the way those dogs listen to you without a word." Max and Bolt stood silent at her sides, still waiting, still watching. "People like you?" He leaned in slightly. "They don't just walk places. They look for things. And We don't like people looking for things. Naomi held his gaze. You're mistaken. Stocky's grin didn't waver. See? Here's the thing. I don't believe you. He moved fast, reaching for her. His fingers clamped around her wrist. That was his mistake. Naomi exploded into motion, twisting her arm free in a seamless motion while her opposite elbow drove into his throat. Stocky stumbled back, gasping, eyes wide in shock as he choked on the impact. Then everything happened at once. The lanky one lunged at her, but Bolt was faster. The Malinois slammed into him, sending him crashing onto the pavement. The third man grabbed at Max's harness and immediately regretted it. Max spun, his teeth clamping down onto the man's arm, dragging him off balance before releasing him with a warning snarl. Naomi barely had time to register the fourth man lunging before she moved. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him forward, then drove her knee into his ribs. Stocky recovered, stumbling forward in blind fury. You... Naomi pivoted, hooking his leg out from under him, sending him crashing back to the ground. Silence fell. The men who weren't downed scrambled to regain their footing. They were no longer laughing. Naomi stood her ground, her breath even, her hands loose at her sides. Max and Bolt remained locked in position beside her, poised, waiting. Stocky pushed himself onto his elbows, his expression darkening with something deeper than anger. Something more dangerous. You think this is over? He spat, his voice ragged. You think you just walk away? Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice eerily calm. You touched me first. Stocky's eyes burned with fury. But then he smirked. You made a mistake, he said. A slow clap echoed from the truck. Naomi turned. A figure stepped out from the driver's side. He was different from the others. No nervous energy, no anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Just a quiet, controlled presence. Duke Calloway. She had never met him, but she knew. Knew from the way the other men looked at him, from the way he carried himself, from the cold amusement in his ice-blue eyes. Well, he drawled, stopping just short of stepping into the circle of his fallen men. This is a problem. He surveyed the scene. The men on the ground, the ones still recovering, Naomi standing firm. His mouth twitched in something resembling amusement. See? I don't like problems, he continued, his voice smooth, too casual. And I sure as hell don't like people asking questions they shouldn't be asking. Naomi didn't respond. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. You should have just minded your own business. She turned her head just slightly, just enough to catch the glow of headlights cutting through the darkness. A second truck. More men. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Naomi Carter stood motionless, her breath measured, her stance firm as Duke Calloway stepped forward, his gaze flicking between the bruised and battered men at her feet. His expression barely shifted, but she caught the slight tensing of his jaw, the way his fingers curled for just a fraction of a second before relaxing again. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't surprised either. He studied her, his pale blue eyes assessing, searching for weakness. A slow, deliberate scrutiny that spoke of experience, of someone who had done this before. Naomi had seen men like him before, calculating, controlled, the kind who built their power not just on brute force, but on the ability to manipulate and control others, the kind who knew exactly how far they could push before breaking someone. The headlights from the second truck grew brighter as it approached, the low hum of its engine punctuating the silence like a steady drumbeat. The sound wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it was deafening. She could hear the gravel crunch beneath its tires as it pulled up alongside the first vehicle, the weight of it pressing into the dirt. The doors swung open. 2 more men stepped out. Unlike the first group, these men were bigger, more solidly built, the kind of muscle people hired when they wanted to make a statement. There was no swagger in their movements, no smirks or casual amusement. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to finish the job. Enforcement. Naomi shifted subtly, barely a movement, but enough to place herself between them and her dogs. Max and Bolt remained poised, silent. their bodies tense and coiled, waiting for her command. Their ears were pricked forward, sharp eyes locked onto the men in front of them. Calloway exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, as if this whole ordeal was nothing more than an inconvenience. He shook his head slightly, as if disappointed. "You should have just walked the other way," he said, his voice carrying an almost casual regret. "Would have been easier for everyone." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She simply watched, measured, calculated. One of the new arrivals, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and hands like cinder blocks, rolled his shoulders. The movement was slow, deliberate, like a man who knew exactly how much damage he could do. "You gonna handle this, or we gonna do it for you?" His voice was deep, gravelly, completely devoid of hesitation. Calloway sighed, shaking his head. "Now, see, I was hoping we wouldn't have to get messy." He gestured vaguely at the men who were still recovering from the initial scuffle, some of them groaning, others struggling to stand. "But you went and embarrassed my boys. That's a real problem." Naomi remained still, her breathing steady, her pulse even. Calloway turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable as he glanced toward the bearded man. "Put her down." The words were spoken without urgency, almost dismissively, but the reaction was immediate. The man moved fast, faster than the others had. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. Naomi barely had time to react before he lunged. She pivoted hard, instincts honed by years of training taking over. She dropped low, evading his grasp just as his arms swiped through empty air, where she had been standing a second ago. Before he could recover, she struck, a brutal, precise blow to his knee. The impact was sharp, direct, sending a shudder through his frame. A sharp grunt escaped him as his leg buckled under the force, but he was strong, too strong to go down from just one hit. The second man, younger, quicker, saw his opening. He rushed her from the side. Naomi saw the movement in her peripheral vision. Her muscles tensed, but before she could react, Max was already there. Silent, fast, a force of pure instinct. The dog launched himself forward, slamming into the man with full force. The impact was brutal. The man went down hard. His body hit the ground with a heavy thud, the force knocking the air from his lungs. His head cracked against the dirt, a sharp, ugly sound. For a brief moment, everything was still. And then, chaos erupted. But there was no time to pause. The bearded man recovered quickly, his hand flying toward his belt. A knife. Naomi reacted instantly. She grabbed his wrist before he could fully draw the blade, twisting sharply until he let out a strangled groan. A second later, she wrenched his arm back and slammed him forward into the side of the truck. The impact stole the air from his lungs. One of the original gang members, still dazed from the first fight, had enough sense to recognize what was happening. "The hell is she?" His words cut off as Bolt lunged. The lean Malinois struck with precision, knocking him flat before retreating just as quickly, returning to Naomi's side. The younger enforcer had barely regained his footing when Max went for him again, snapping his jaws just inches from his face. The man flinched back, raising his hands in reflex. And that's when Naomi moved in. She grabbed him by the collar, her fingers clamping down with a firm, unyielding grip, and drove her knee into his stomach, hard. The impact was brutal, precise, sending a shock wave through his body. He crumpled almost instantly, his torso folding inward like a collapsing structure, his breath escaping in a strangled gasp. His hands instinctively shot toward his midsection, grasping at nothing, his body trying and failing to recover from the sudden, crushing force. The sound of his breath hitching, the sharp exhale of pain, echoed in the heavy silence around them. Calloway's smirk was gone now. He was watching her differently. This wasn't amusement anymore. This wasn't a game. This wasn't some woman who had gotten lucky in a scuffle. This wasn't some bystander who had thrown a few good punches out of sheer desperation. She knew what she was doing, but he hadn't figured out how. Yet. His men were still reeling, stumbling, groaning, caught between pain and disorientation. The bearded one was slumped against the truck, his chest rising and falling in uneven, labored breaths. His eyes were unfocused, his posture just shy of defeat. The younger one was on his knees, his head lowered, one arm cradling his ribs protectively, his jaw clenched in barely restrained pain. The night stretched around them, thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and the lingering trace of cigarette smoke. Calloway exhaled, rolling his shoulders with deliberate ease. "You're starting to piss me off, Carter." Naomi wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, but her breathing was still steady, controlled. She wasn't winded. She wasn't faltering. She wasn't afraid. "Walk away," she said, her voice even, unwavering. The men still standing bristled at that. Anger flickered across their faces, mixing with something else, something rawer, humiliation. Calloway tilted his head slightly, his gaze unreadable. Then, finally, his lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smirk, wasn't quite a grin. "See? I could do that," he mused, his tone almost conversational. "Could let you walk. But here's the thing." He glanced at the others, a brief flicker of movement that didn't seem to mean much, until it did. "You're already a problem, and I don't like leaving problems unsolved." Naomi's gut tightened. She heard it before she saw it, the telltale shift of weight behind her. A small, almost imperceptible scrape of a boot against gravel, the faint rustle of movement. It was enough. She turned, just in time. The bearded enforcer, his knife was finally free.